Hello everyone, and greetings from Geneva. My name is Yanis Bourgeois. I'm an Economic Affairs Officer in the Division of the Council and Trade Negotiations Committee of the WTO. Through this virtual course today, I will provide you with an overview of ongoing work within the organization on the topic of e-commerce. This update is quite timely, especially in light of the upcoming 12th Ministerial Conference, and given the ever-growing interest in e-commerce these past years, including more recently due to the role that e-commerce played during the pandemic and with respect to economic recovery. Let us begin with a brief word on COVID-19 and e-commerce. The UNCTAD study that you can see on the screen illustrates the resilience of e-commerce during the pandemic compared to the broader global economic impact. While we can see on the left-hand side that there is a clear decline in global goods and services trade during the pandemic, on the right we can see that e-commerce remained a positive and strong trend, and this particularly because of consumers adapting their shopping habits, and as a corollary of this, the fact that many brick and mortar businesses try to shift as much as possible to e-commerce operations, and this includes also micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. The pandemic also contributed to further accelerating the digital transformation of the economy, and this especially in some sectors like gaming and digital entertainment, as well as teleworking and e-learning, and we are the example of this today. At the WTO, throughout the discussions and the negotiations on e-commerce, delegations have been stressing the important role played by electronic commerce both during the pandemic and in supporting economic recovery from COVID-19. And we are also hearing from members that the pandemic also illustrated a gaping digital divide, for instance through unequal connectivity and infrastructure. And addressing the digital development concerns raised in the context of COVID-19 is also at the core of members' discussions. For those of you who are interested in delving deeper into this topic, in 2020, the WTO Secretariat published an information note on COVID-19 and e-commerce, which is available on the WTO website. With respect to global estimates of e-commerce, UNCTAD provided estimates of the global value of e-commerce sales, both B2B and B2C, in 2019. According to their research, this value reached around $26.7 trillion in 2019, just before the pandemic. And the estimated value of B2B e-commerce globally amounts to $21.8 trillion, which represents approximately 82% of all e-commerce transactions. However, at this point, I think a brief apartheid is required, as measuring e-commerce is not without its challenges, and this therefore calls for caution to a certain extent. Measuring e-commerce can be challenging for a number of reasons, and the final outcome one obtains may ultimately depend on, for instance, the speed at which e-commerce grows and evolves, the capacity of some countries to produce official statistics, the fact that firms conduct both e-commerce and traditional commerce simultaneously. It may also depend on the exact definition that is applied to e-commerce, and the potential overlap and confusion between goods and services that are digitally ordered and those that are digitally delivered. And for more information on estimates of electronic commerce and relevant challenges, do not hesitate to take a look at the handbook on measuring digital trade, which was jointly prepared by the OECD and the IMF, as well as the WTO. I will now provide you with a briefing on ongoing work at the WTO on e-commerce. And e-commerce within the organization is being discussed under two parallel tracks, and it is essential to be able to distinguish between both of these. I will first give you an update on the multilateral track, that is the work and the discussions resulting from the 1998 Ministerial Declaration on Global Electronic Commerce. And by that I mean work under the work program and regarding the moratorium. And this will be followed with an update on the ongoing work by a group of WTO members within the plurilateral track on e-commerce, and that is the Joint Statement Initiative on Electronic Commerce, which was launched in 2017 on the margins of MC11 in Buenos Aires. Before jumping to the latest updates on multilateral discussions on e-commerce, it is important to recall the background for these discussions. Contrary to what some may think, e-commerce is not a new topic at the WTO. In fact, it was first discussed nearly 25 years ago. At the second WTO Ministerial Conference in May 1998, which was held in Geneva, ministers adopted a declaration on global electronic commerce. And this declaration contained two main elements. First, a mandate for the General Council to establish a work program on electronic commerce, and second, a provisional moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. The work program on electronic commerce was later adopted by the General Council in September 1998, and this work program instructs members to examine all trade-related aspects of e-commerce. This includes exploring the relationship between e-commerce and WTO agreements, as well as relevant economic, financial, and development needs of developing countries. Work is conducted under the overall guidance of the General Council and in the respective bodies, namely the Councils for Trade and Services, the Council for Trade and Goods, the Council for TRIPS, and the Committee on Trade and Development. One should note, however, that discussions on e-commerce are more active in certain bodies compared to others, and the role of the General Council is to review the work undertaken in relevant bodies on issues under their purview, which are related to e-commerce. So for instance, under the CTS, the Council for Trade and Services, the members will be tasked with work on the scope of e-commerce within the WTO, including with respect to GATT's mode of supplies. In the Council for Trade and Goods, members will cover work on rules of origins, customs duties and other charges, market access and classification. In the Council for TRIPS, members will examine the protection and enforcement of relevant IP rights and new technologies. In the Committee on Trade and Development, members will focus on economic prospects and challenges for developing countries and micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. The General Council has been mandated by the work program to play a central role in these discussions and to keep the work program under continuous review. The General Council decision on the work program also clarifies what e-commerce encompasses in the discussions held in the WTO. And I should note that there is no universal definition of e-commerce, and the term may have a different meaning depending on the context in which it is used. But in the context of the WTO work program specifically, The term has been defined as the production, the distribution, the marketing, sale, or delivery of goods and services by electronic means. So we can say that in the work program's context, e-commerce is somewhat more than simply purchasing things online, as it includes the purchase through electronic means, not only of physical products, but also of digital products and services. Now turning to the moratorium. In 1998, in the Declaration on Global Electronic Commerce, as we saw earlier, members called for a provisional moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. Now, at the time, no member was imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions, so the membership simply agreed to continue with that practice. Since 1998, discussions on the moratorium have mainly been focusing on the scope and definition of electronic transmissions. Another major focus has also been the revenue implications of the moratorium and whether there are reliable figures to measure these implications. A third issue has been the technical feasibility to impose customs duties on electronic transmissions and whether it is cost effective or whether there are alternatives. And finally, members have been discussing the broader impact of the moratorium on trade and development. And in the context of these discussions, there have been different views expressed, including on the benefits of extending the moratorium. And to illustrate this, I can briefly mention two submissions presented to the General Council in 2020. The first one by India and South Africa, and the second by a group of 13 members coordinated by Switzerland. Both submissions mainly ground the respective arguments on different studies, and you can see the references on the screen. On the one hand, India and South Africa have mainly based their arguments on a number of reports from UNCTAD. Their analysis suggests that it is mostly developing countries that are suffering loss in customs revenue from the moratorium, and they also argue that customs duties are a simple and effective policy tool to generate tariff revenue from these imports. On the other hand, Switzerland and other co-sponsors have made reference to a 2019 OECD paper, which argues that there are benefits to duty-free electronic transmissions. For instance, consumer surplus, reduction of transport costs, which are favorable to businesses, including MSMEs and including in developing countries. And the proponents also argue that these benefits resulting from the moratorium clearly outweigh potential foregone government revenue. So the moratorium has been a major focus of discussion for members over the past years, and more work needs to be done for them in order to reach a common understanding, not only on the impact of the moratorium, but also on its scope. For instance, some delegations continue to argue that the moratorium only applies to the transmission itself, excluding its content, whereas others argue that such an interpretation would render the moratorium meaningless. Since 1998, decisions on the work program on electronic commerce have been a regular feature of ministerial conferences, and generally the practice has been for members to take note of the discussions and the work done when appropriate under the work program, to commit to continuing work under the work program, and to maintain the practice of not imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions, so to extend the moratorium, generally for a period of 2 years or until the following ministerial. The most recent decision on the work programme was adopted by the General Council in December 2019 and not at the ministerial conference initially planned in Kazakhstan, which was postponed several times due to COVID-19. This decision calls for the reinvigoration of the work programme and for structured discussions on any trade-related topic brought forward by members, including issues related to the moratorium. The 2019 decision also extends the moratorium until MC12 and instructs the General Council to report to the conference. So what are the main elements to bear in mind in the lead up to MC12? Well, first, one should note that the work programme was discussed extensively at the General Council meetings held last year in 2021 and earlier this year in February 2022. And work also continues in the relevant bodies entrusted with the implementation of the work programme. It's also important to recall that in July 2021, the previous General Council Chair, Ambassador Decio Castillo from Honduras, convened a structured discussion that allowed members to share their national experiences and delve deeper into some of the issues related to the moratorium and to e-commerce more generally. The main topics discussed were, first, electronic transmissions, their scope and their impact. Second, the imposition of internal non-discriminatory taxes on electronic transmissions as alternatives to customs duties. So this could touch upon value-added taxes or goods and services taxes, for instance. And third point discussed in these structured discussions was the challenge or the challenges and opportunities of e-commerce, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to this, and in preparation for MC12, the current chair of the General Council, Ambassador Chambovet from Switzerland, has been conducting consultations with members, including on the topic of e-commerce, the work programme and the moratorium. And these discussions will continue to intensify in the lead up to MC12, as I recall that the General Council is expected to report to ministers on this work. With this in mind, it is useful to recall certain points that arose in the discussions. Different groups of members continue to have different views on the moratorium. This entails that some members continue to wish to see the moratorium made permanent, or at a minimum see its extension as a priority until the following ministerial conference. On the other hand, certain other members consider that there needs to be further clarity on the scope and impact of the moratorium in order to consider its potential extension. Another point is the linkage between the moratorium and the work programme. And this entails that, in the view of some delegations, if the moratorium was to expire, then there may not necessarily be consensus on continuing work under the work programme. Finally, a third important point to recall is the linkage between the TRIPS moratorium on non-violation situations complaints and the e-commerce moratorium, as they have regularly been associated at past ministerial conferences, not for substantive but for political reasons, rather as potential trade-offs. Given the persisting differences among members' views, 2 draft ministerial decisions were put forward by members late last year, and members engaged on these drafts in an effort to bridge relevant gaps ahead of the conference. The first draft, contained in document 831, provides that members would agree to continue the work under the work programme, based on the existing mandate. It also instructs the General Council to hold periodic reviews of the work on the basis of reports that may be submitted by relevant WTO bodies. This draft ministerial decision also instructs the General Council to report to MC13 and renews the moratorium until MC13 as well. A second draft ministerial decision is contained in document 838, and it contains some preambular language on the reinvigoration and extension of the work programme without addressing the fate of the moratorium. Before sharing this draft, India and South Africa had also circulated another paper which highlighted the need for more clarity on the scope and impact of the moratorium, and this paper was circulated in document 838. As delegations could not reach consensus on the way forward, the GC chair suggested that the two draft ministerial decisions be forwarded to ministers for their consideration. And one should note that since they were first circulated, these drafts have both been revised to include additional co-sponsors. However, in light of the deterioration of the sanitary situation and relevant travel restrictions, MC12 was postponed, and it was initially supposed to be held in December 2021. Since these topics are also linked de facto, it's important that I provide an update on the fate of the TRIPS moratorium. And the TRIPS Council in November 2021 agreed on a draft ministerial decision seeking the renewal of the TRIPS non-violation and situations complaints moratorium. And this decision is therefore expected to be adopted at MC12. So all of these points also have to be factored in when considering the e-commerce work program and moratorium at MC12. And given the limited time left for extensive discussions, as MC12 has been rescheduled in June 2022, there has been a call for delegations to show pragmatism. With that, I think I have covered the main elements from the side of the multilateral track, and I will now move to the plurilateral work on e-commerce. Aside from the work program, a group of WTO members is also discussing e-commerce within a parallel plurilateral track under the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce. Let me give you a brief background first. You will recall that on the sidelines of MC11 in Buenos Aires, which was held in December 2017, several groups of like-minded members decided to issue joint statements to advance discussions on certain topics. And these various member-led initiatives include e-commerce, but we can also find such initiatives on investment facilitation, on MSMEs, on domestic regulations and services, and on trade and women's economic empowerment. In 2020, new initiatives were launched on trade and the environment, and they establish structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability and an informal dialogue on plastics solution. It is important to note that these groups do not have the same number of participants, but their coordinators from each of these groups often recall that such initiatives are open to all members, and they also encourage other members to join them. At MC11, 71 WTO members had agreed to initiate exploratory work together towards future WTO negotiations that would focus on trade-related aspects of e-commerce. In January 2019, there were 76 WTO members that had confirmed their intention to commence negotiations on these trade-related aspects of e-commerce. As of today, in April 2022, there are 86 WTO members participating in these discussions, Ecuador being the latest to join in 2020. The objective that has been set out by participants is to seek to achieve a high standard outcome that builds on existing WTO agreements and frameworks with the participation of as many WTO members as possible. We can note that participants currently account for over 90% of global trade, and this includes developed, developing, and least developed countries, whether big or small. So, how have these discussions effectively been conducted within the WTO? Well, first, it is important to note that the e-commerce GSI is co-convened by Australia, Japan, and Singapore, and the discussions are based on members' textual submissions, which are available to the whole membership. Members' proposals are generally based on language from existing FTAs or RTAs, such as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, or the most recent US-Canada-Mexico Agreement, the USMCA. These negotiations are conducted through a combination of plenary, focus group, and small group meetings. And plenary meetings provide members with an opportunity for transparency and for small group facilitators under each topic to report on ongoing work. Participants throughout their discussions regularly reiterate that the work under the GSI is guided by transparency and inclusion. And throughout their negotiations, participants have been encouraged by the co-conveners to consider the relevant opportunities and challenges faced by members, especially developing countries and least developed countries, as well as micro, medium, and small-sized enterprises. The issues raised in member submissions are discussed under 6 main themes, and I will touch upon some of the issues discussed under each themes right now. So, for instance, under enabling e-commerce, members discuss facilitation of e-transactions, as well as paperless trading, online payments, and e-signatures and e-authentication, for instance. Under the theme openness and e-commerce, members will discuss access to internet and data, such as open government data, open internet access, and competition between online platforms. They will also touch upon cross-border data flows and localization. Under building trust in e-commerce, participants cover both consumer trust and business trust. That means consumer protection, spam, the protection of source code, and encryption technologies. Members have also been discussing market access for goods and services and other cross-cutting issues such as transparency, development, cooperation, or cybersecurity. Finally, with respect to telecommunications, their discussions are mainly focused on updating the 1996 WTO reference paper on telecommunication services. I will now conclude by providing you with a brief update on GSI work prior to MC12. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, GSI participants have been able to adapt and keep advancing in their work, especially through small group meetings and informal meetings in virtual formats, in which delegations have been further streamlining their proposals by reducing the number of alternative textual options and brackets. In September 2021, the co-conveners circulated an updated, revised version of a consolidated negotiating text which takes stock and reflects on progress made thus far. A first version of this consolidated text was circulated in December 2020. This text also serves as the foundation for ongoing and future negotiations until and also perhaps beyond MC12 or until the next revision. Clean articles have been reached on several topics: on spam, on e-authentication and e-signatures, on electronic contracts, on paperless trading, on online consumer protection, and on open government data. An article on transparency and part of the article on paperless trading have been parked. This is the term used by the co-conveners to mean that it will be subject to final scope and legal structure of the initiative's outcome. These past months, focused discussions during plenary meetings have also touched upon capacity building and technical assistance issues within the Joint Statement Initiative. Focused discussions have also been held on more difficult or challenging areas, such as data-related topics, market access, and the final legal architecture of the initiative's outcome. At a press conference held on 14 December 2021, the co-conveners issued a joint statement acknowledging the progress made and highlighting the need for continued engagement to secure convergence on the majority of remaining issues by the end of 2022. The statement also provides that the co-conveners will identify opportunities for ministers to provide guidance on key issues in negotiations this year. Before concluding this presentation, for those of you who are interested in learning more about e-commerce, I invite you to our new e-commerce web portal, which was prepared by the WTO Secretariat. This portal contains an e-library with several databases for relevant WTO documents. This includes members' submissions, reports by the chairs of relevant WTO bodies, speeches, research, publications, all on e-commerce or e-commerce related issues. There is also a multimedia page and an e-commerce jargon buster. With this, I conclude my update on e-commerce, and thank you very much for attending this online course. Should you have any questions relating to this course, I would be happy to exchange with you. So do not hesitate to contact me via the email address displayed on your screen. Thank you very much, and goodbye.